Well, hello there, and welcome to this, the 174th edition of DF Direct Weekly, our weekly show where, as always, we discuss the latest gaming and technology news. We're going to be shifting up the panel this week. Joining me, first of all, Tom Morgan. Hello.
Hi there. I brought my big mic with me, as ever, and glad to be part of the show.
And Oliver Mackenzie. Hi.
Yes, Rich, pretty stacked docket this week. Should be fun to have a little chat on this very unconventional show.
Before we move on to the first news topic, obviously, shout outs to store.digitalfoundry.net for all our merchandising wares, including, well, you can't really see it at the moment, but the mouse pad is now fully occupied. So there's that. Do check that out. Also, quickly wanted to follow up on the story we ran last week on Xbox One consoles failing to update. As I said in that direct, we were talking to Microsoft about it, and a solution has rolled out. We were told by Microsoft that it was fixed. I'd say it's right now, at least, it's a bit of a half fix. Machines that wouldn't update before do now update, but then they seem to reach an error when you reach 88%. We've had this confirmed on 3 different units now. If this is a problem for you, if you reach that 88%, then basically you need to go into the recovery mode, which is, I think you press the sync button, the eject button, hold those down, press the Xbox button to turn it on, keep those sync and eject buttons held down. You'll get a couple of beeps and go into recovery mode, and then you use factory reset. You should be good to go from there. But I understand a full, proper firmware update is en route soon that's going to ensure you don't need to do that. It'll just update as it should. But with that, I guess it's kind of good news, but with that, let's move on to our first news topic. Okay, so Star Wars Outlaws received a new preview this week. Lots of outlets had hands-on. I think it was a remote opportunity, and then something like NVIDIA Shadowplay was used to record the footage locally on the cloud device, which was then sent to the various outlets. I want to give a shout out to Ian Higton and Jim Trinker of Gamer Network, who helped us out by supplying some footage, because we weren't invited to this one, which is kind of weird. In common with that preview, we also have PC specs. Oliver, why don't we talk about what you saw in the footage first? Because it's basically the closest we're going to get to the game pre-launch or pre-review period, at least.
Yeah, I think it is really important to emphasize that the footage we're seeing probably was recorded with a solution like NVIDIA Shadowplay, and it's 1080p. Also, it's probably not representative of the maxed out PC experience, because we see it is using some shadow maps. There are some screen space errors in the reflection, and those probably will be cleaned up a little bit with the RTX Ti that we see and the higher end reflection options in the PC version. At least judging from Avatar, some of those things should be cleaned up a little bit, like with skinned objects and the reflections and stuff like that. But it does look very good. I think a lot of the metallic interior spaces look really good. It reminded me a lot of last year's Star Wars Jedi Survivor in good ways, in very positive ways. But here, with a much larger scope, much more open environments, much more broad interior city areas, which I think looks really cool. And that's something we didn't see a lot of in Avatar. There was a little bit of that, but mostly it was these more organic jungle type environments, not so many of the interiors. That's cool. The materials look great. GI and reflections look awesome. Tons of detail in the environments, and they're lit in a really artistically interesting and compelling way. And I think the exteriors also look pretty great, which is probably what you'd expect from the studio that produced Avatar. It looks very pleasing. The foliage looks good. Draw distance is good. Like, it looks very technically accomplished in that respect. If I was to kind of poke and prod at it, I think in this preview at least, some of the third-person animation doesn't look quite as good. I'm not a huge fan of the way that combat sometimes plays out visually, at least in this footage, but I think a big part of that is just the relative lack of motion blur. I think with a healthy amount of per object and camera motion blur, some of those fine movements would come together, because right now they look a little bit like staccato and they don't blend quite as well as I'd like. But I think a lot of that is just the fact that, you know, in games like this, cinematic third-person games, I'm so used to seeing lots of motion blur. And unfortunately, at the moment, it seems quite restrained. I think there might be some per object blur, might be turned off, turned on a per scene basis. I know that we noted that with some other previews. Could be the case that there's no camera motion blur whatsoever. Actually, I suspect that probably is the case in this footage, at least judging from like the speeder sections and stuff like that, where you should see probably some substantial camera motion blur. You're not seeing that in this case. So I hope that's something that they offer, at least as a toggle, because I think in Avatar it looked pretty good. I don't know why they're not leaning on that technology now, but it seems like a pretty obvious win, at least in my opinion. You know, I like motion blur a lot, but in my opinion, will be a win for a game like this.
Yeah, there's been some controversy about the way the game is looking and running, and I think there's a combination of factors here. But I think we are just going to be rerunning a conversation we've had in the past, where we do think that NVIDIA Shadow Play or some other internal PC solution has been used to grab the footage, which isn't optimal. And the other thing about it is, I mean, if we sort of skip through frame by frame on the footage that came out of the press previews, it's obviously dropping frames as well. So you've got this combination of two different factors that's kind of combining to make the game run in a way that I'm not sure is actually going to be indicative of the quality of the final release. And we've talked at length on DF Direct about how it's really important to get your marketing assets right. And there's something definitely amiss here. Now, Avatar didn't have any of these problems once you actually, went hands-on with the game. So hopefully it's going to be the same here, as obviously there's a lot of commonality in the technology. Something else I noticed, and we just sort of picked up on this just before the Direct, Oliver, was that all of the preview assets seen to date have been using a 21:9 aspect ratio to give that kind of cinematic look. But it looks like the PCs that were given to the previewers had the game set to standard 16:9. So it's, I'm going to be curious to see how the console versions pan out as to what, which aspect ratio they use, because there's actually been quite a lot of, how can I describe it? Something that came up in the marketing was that they're looking to emulate the feel of the original trilogy movies by actually simulating the lenses that George Lucas used in that trilogy. Which obviously would be a better fit, I guess, if you're looking to mimic that with a 21:9 aspect ratio, not so much with 16, I suspect. Tom, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, there's a lot of it to echo what Oliver just said, but it is a gorgeous looking game. We've seen footage of it before, more outskirts areas in this one, which I think, for me, just shows the level of quality of the engine's ability to stream in a lot of, foliage very quickly and get a real mileage on that jet bike that she's riding there. It's I still think Jedi Survivor for me personally sets the bar of quality for these sort of exploratory Star Wars games, but I've yet to see, as we said, what they've got in store for us in terms of the settings on PC, because there's there could be a lot more. I mean, we're seeing SSR, we're seeing all that stuff going on PC here, and at 1080p in this footage as well, and with frame drops. So really keen to see what it can do. The interiors look great though. You've got that baked GI, could be approximated RT, but it looks fantastic. You've got all the volumetrics there. It looks really looks the part. But
it's going to be using the same engine as Avatar, so it'll be quite a lot more dynamic than having everything baked, I suspect.
Yeah, you'd hope so.
Yeah, I think it looks fantastic. I'm just concerned about how it's going to play. And if you look at, actually, there's obviously the release of the PC specs happened as well. And initially I was thinking, wow, this is really, really heavy because, let's bring them up. Let's take a look. Basically, for the minimum specification, they're talking about a Ryzen 5 3600 paired with a GTX 1660 or an RX 5600 XT. I actually think that's kind of reasonable for a game running on a cutting edge engine. And it's not that much different to what we saw with Avatar. The 1660 isn't that much different to the 1070 that was specified for Avatar. Moving into the recommended specifications, they're talking about a 3060 Ti. They're talking about 1080p 60 there, with upscaling from, I guess, 720p. It's kind of weird with Snowdrop because they have a fixed upscaler mode and a biased upscaler mode. The biased upscaler mode actually increases the internal resolution. But yeah, that's 3060 Ti for a non-native 1080p. Again, that's really heavy. But again, we saw something very, very similar with Avatar. So it's kind of a bit of a weird sort of quandary we're facing here, in that Avatar actually proved to be quite scalable if you were willing to work with upscaling. And, I had a great experience with GPUs that were worse than some of the stuff that's being mooted here for recommended PC specs. So I'm not sure whether they're being a bit cautious or whether this is genuinely a heavy game. Looking at the higher specifications here, again, this is, yes, very similar to what's happening with Avatar. The difference this time, though, is that we've got the NVIDIA GI, right, Oliver? So I would expect that it would actually be significantly heavier than Avatar.
With I think it's RTX Ti on,
right.
I think it's RTX Ti with this title.
Yeah.
I actually don't know that if you look at like ultra settings, high settings, if those would factor in RTX Ti. It seems to me like that might be a separate setting, especially because for RTX Ti, you're going to have to update the BVH very, very frequently. Whereas like these network games are not designed around that. So like it's going to be expensive. I think it's going to be pretty expensive, right? Or at least has the potential to be quite expensive. And then you have like DLSS 3.5. Initially they were saying DLSS 3, but in more recent press materials they're talking about 3.5. So there is some like bespoke stuff. But I kind of think it'll be separate, honestly. I mean, I could be totally wrong here.
Yeah, I suspect it. Well, I think it does have ray reconstruction as well.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm hoping that, well, here's the thing, right? Avatar didn't ship with DLSS 3. You got FSR 3, which I guess is, a fine all-in-one solution for any GPU, but DLSS 3 would have been welcome. I'm kind of hoping that whatever work they've done with Outlaws here could be retrofitted to Avatar. Just so it's, fully feature complete with the latest technologies. What can I say? This one has been a bit tricky because I honestly think they could have done a much better job with the assets that they put out there. They don't look right. And yet, what we know of this engine with Avatar, it's not a problem at all. So I don't know whether it's just a marketing issue or an assets issue, but we're going to need to go hands-on with this one. What I would say is that, please don't use Shadowplay or any kind of internal video recording solution for your marketing assets. It's not great.
Yeah. I think if anything, just judging from these specs, because they are so close to what we saw from Avatar, like you said, there's just a couple of differences here and there, nothing really that big. I think that probably does bode okay for the console version, because if they're talking about, same specs, if they're talking about a 6700 XT being able to pull off like 720p upscale to 1080p, that probably means maybe for the consoles, it'll be 1440p with a dynamic res there, going from like 720p to, I don't know, 1260p, whatever it was in Avatar. It might be a pretty similar experience, and I think that'll be a very solid visual experience for console owners, probably, if it does follow that same trajectory.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I think we just need to wait and see what the game is going to look like.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts there, Tom?
Only that it was kind of expected to see these hugely demanding specs, given that it is a current gen game in focus and it follows the trend set by Avatar, I guess. And I'm glad to see this sort of thing, that we're not being anchored to the last gen console standards, and that we can get these fundamentally more cutting edge experiences, open world experiences, which are built around that structure, kind of going. So yeah, it doesn't bother me to see those high end specs. Bring them on, I think.
Yeah, and I think in fairness, Avatar proved that it is scalable. As long as you're a bit more creative with the settings, and maybe this is being a bit conservative, but we'll just have to wait and see. And with that, let's move on to the next news story. Okay, second news story of the week. Not so much a news story, but Nobody Wants to Die is a title that people have been really interested in, been asked to check it out. And we found some time to do so. Tom, I'm going to go to you first on this one, because you have checked it out on consoles, right?
That's right. I've got to say, when I saw Nobody Wants to Die in bold on the docket, I thought that's quite a topic header. And I agree wholeheartedly with that feeling. Yeah. There's a lot. I mean, we've been meaning to cover this one for I think a week or two now, and it's a few requests in the comments, and I think for good reason. It's from Critical Hit Games, Unreal Engine 5. It's kind of as we said, like a visual novel. I'd say it's equal parts Blade Runner, Bioshock, and even LA Noire with the sort of branching dialogue and all sort of that ability to navigate through your decisions. Yeah, and it's a gorgeous looking game. From the outset, you just open up to this futuristic New York City, looking over Times Square with all the flying cars. You're a down on your luck detective, alcoholic, traumatic past. All the cliches are coming out, so it's they're not holding punches on that. And yeah, when you get into it, I mean, I looked at the PS5 version, and it looks gorgeous no matter which mode you use, but there are two. You get a 1080p 60 mode, the performance mode, and a 1440p 30 mode, quality mode. And not just resolution that divides them, there's also ray tracing on the quality mode, which does actually, I believe it's Lumen in this case, being a UE5, and it has all the telltale characteristics that we saw in other utilizations of Lumen in software. So you've got when you look up and down, you can see the effect of Lumen is still in place. You can see the sky, like the ceiling of this interior building, the first place where you go to as a detective to kind of, this high headquarters. There's marble, there's all these reflective elements, and the great thing is there's even a reflective ceiling where if you look up, you can see the entire room from looking up. That's with ray tracing, but with SSR, all that disappears. I think I've got some nice comparison assets for you all over there. So there's another aspect to the ray tracing mode, though, which is that it has obviously an SSR element in there to fill in the gaps around the Lumen ray traced element. We saw it in Marvel Rivals as well, but if you look up and down, you still see some traces of SSR layering in this extra detail. So we're not entirely outside the getting away from the artifacts that go with SSR. Still, it's a really good use of it, and just looking over my notes here, it's gorgeous looking game. Lots of great sort of dynamic elements filling the air. You've got ash, you've got volumetrics, you've got all this great stuff kind of that just builds this atmosphere. But yeah, there's reports online that this being the PS5 version, on Series S, there's no kind of quality mode available, so you're just stuck with SSR. Decent amount of sort of options on PC as well. I gave that a try. It is not explicitly mentioning any sort of Lumen setting, but it goes up to Ultra on reflections and GI and all the rest, so there's no explicit mention there, but it is interestingly comparing PC maxed out to PS5. PS5 comes quite close in most respects as well. I got it running on the RTX 4080, and it was just in need of a bit of DLSS quality mode there to get it running at 4K or upscaling to 4K, but it got over the line just about at 60 FPS with a couple of improvements to AO, but mostly PS5 holds up by comparison quite well. But yeah, I don't know how you guys found it in playing. Did you play it on PC, Rich, or PS5?
No, I had a quick go on the PS5. It does look really, really, really impressive. It's not really my type of game, though. It's kind of like highlight icon to progress, certainly in the initial initial stages. It's not really my cup of tea. But Oliver, I know you were impressed by it, right?
Yes, I played it for long enough that I could control the character. Let's put it that way, which took a while. Maybe like 15 minutes.
Yeah. Takes a bit of patience, doesn't it?
It does. Oh, I mean, I think it's, I think it's an interesting game. I think what they're doing with it is cool. It's maybe not my speed totally, at least for this kind of game.
Yeah, I can understand that.
But I think it looks really great. I played it in the quality mode. They are using Lumen. It looks like software Lumen. If I had to guess, it has a lot of characteristic artifacts, like you said, of software Lumen. There's some screen space elements, but I mean, the tracing looks really good. The lighting looks superb. I think the assets are super, super high quality. The gameplay, it's a very limited game in terms of what they're doing gameplay wise and what they actually allow you to traverse and look through, and it's all very handholdy, at least from what I could see. But some of the sights like absolutely stunning, and the lighting technology just makes it look superb. So I think it's a really really exciting looking game, a really satisfying looking game. One thing I did note that was sort of funny is in that kind of intro sequence, you're flying through the air in your car and there's windshield wipers, and every time the windshield wipers go down, they hide the animated texture for the rain, but every time they go up, they reveal it again. So it's not really clearing the rain. I thought that was funny. That's just one of those things, But yeah, looks superb, looks super high quality, super high production values, but obviously it's a more limited title, but I think that gives them the freedom to make a game that looks awesome.
Yeah, for sure. There's I think, I don't know about you, Oliver, but I think the quality mode, right, is the way to go for this one, or it feels like if you've got that choice on console.
Yeah, the performance
it's not
mode,
really...
Not so good performance. Some inconsistency
sure.
there. But the quality mode felt like straight 30 to me, at least judging from what I saw. So
yeah, I've got to be honest. I was like you. I got a kind of just a taster of it about 30 minutes in, enough to see the, flying through the New York skies, and then that first headquarters area, that Art Deco style building. And you've got performance mode holds up well there at least, but it's dropping to like 45 FPS lowest while you're like flying through the skies. So it is kind of, maybe VR can support some of that, but not to the drops to 45 really. But so quality mode feels like the way to go on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely jarring though, moving from a target 60 to 30. But the thing is that it is very, very variable, which is quite surprising if it's a native 1080p.
True. It's very true.
Yeah. No guarantees. I mean, we've kind of learned our lesson never to promise videos. But do you think we should be doing this one in more depth?
Oh, hard to say. I think there's a lot to say on the PC versions. Maybe It's one for Alex to dive into. There's a lot of cool stuff here, but it is, I think, the thing about doing a review, or like a mini tech review, if you like, on the DF Direct is it kind of works out that you get all the essentials out, like 90% of what you want to say, in a bite-sized chunk, without having to spend ages kind of laboring over a full video. I'll obviously send all the assets over to you, Oliver, and you can kind of show what I've seen. But it is, and there's obviously lots more to play. This is not an epic, but there's a lot more environments to check out, and I'd love to see them. So I might even play it myself after this, and if there's anything to report back, I will. All
right, good stuff. Let's move on. Okay, we're sort of picking up on a news story that actually kicked off a week or two ago. It looks like Electronic Arts is significantly upgrading its engine to support new RT features for its sports titles. And I was first tipped off about this when Wesley at IGN, used to work at Game Network, now works at IGN, and now I guess we're all one happy family. Even so, it looks as though there's going to be ray tracing added to FC25, which is basically FIFA in all but name. But Tom, you've been looking into this a bit more deeply, right? And we do seem to have a working example of this technology out now in the form of college football, right? I'm curious. Yeah. Is it the same stuff we should be expecting in FIFA/FC25, or is this different? It's difficult to say because the initial report on IGN wasn't actually specific about what they're doing with ray tracing. They're talking about ray traced and occlusion. That sounds like a misquote or something. Anyway, what do you make of all of this?
It feels like it would make a lot of sense. Being the same engine, Frostbite at its core, FC25 coming up. What was interesting about that article from Wesley was it's promising a graphics mode toggle in FC25,
right?
Which is we've never had that in FIFA, before. So it's always been you just boot it up and play. I don't think FIFA players it generally. There's not much interest in dropping to a 30 FPS quality mode if that makes sense.
It makes no sense.
Yeah, so it's been 60 all the way, and I think this generation it's always 4K native I believe that's right. So come along this mode, and that's coming up later this year, September 27th, FC25. So we'll be able to check that out and do side-by-side comparisons because there is a mode to toggle. What is interesting about College Football 25 is that there's no mode toggle from what I can see. Like, I went through the menus everywhere, which leads me to believe, correct me in the comments, but it leads me to believe that it's on by default, and that it is applied when it's needed, if not in certain areas, then all the time. It's also interesting and telling that there is it's running at a native 1440p on PS5 before being upscaled, which is lower than FC24. And also, interestingly, there are these sort of several frame delays between every camera cut. And I mentioned that because there's a very interesting presentation, SIGGRAPH presentation. It was done in 2021, I believe. It's from the sort of seed development team. And this RT tech that's used in college football, it has been in development by Seed, Microsoft, and in collaboration with the people who work on Frostbite. And this is the first time that it's being used in a Frostbite title. So yeah, it's very much like giving us a heads up on what it would be like. But this presentation showed that it's using GIBS, which stands for Global Illumination Based on Surfals. Mm-hmm. And from what I understand reading this, Surfals, it's all hardware-based global illumination, ray tracing. And the Surfals part relates to these disks that are planted on top of geometry on the fly as you fly through. You in a 3D game, you kind of fly through and it'll automatically populate across geometry, and then it stays permanently fixed in place. And it's a interesting way to approximate ray tracing by averaging out the light values as it hits those surfaces, and if there are any parts that intersect, they can average that out and give a kind of realistic looking sort of global illumination effect with occlusion as well. So this supports, so it works well for GI, and in particular it works well for a sports game where there's lots of hard surfaces, but it also supports sort of characters as well, skinned meshes. So you've got all the interactions across the players, and it's really noticeable when you build up the game just how beautifully lit all these players are as they enter the stand, and they've got the helmets on, the mascots, the materials on the mascot. It's all just gorgeously lit. The trick there being it's 30 FPS, and cutscenes and replays in college football, much like FIFA, all run at 30, and then it switches to 60 in gameplay. So what's not clear to me is if it's activated in gameplay. I'm pretty sure, I'm hoping it will be, but it's something we'll be able to confirm with FIFA when we can switch it on and off and really dial into, the Zeus, what's going on there. Because GI, it can be hard to kind of pick out when it's only on, and the effect is amazing, but that's what it is. Mm-hmm.
But it's always 1440p.
Always, yeah, exactly. So always in cutscenes and gameplay, it's always 1440p, measured after like a camera cut. So
I just did some Googling on the Frostbite engine, and there is actually a technology post from EA basically confirming it is the Gibbs system that's in college football.
Yes.
And it is using the Surfals. Surfals were actually used in Forza Horizon as well. But they're talking here is the use of hardware ray tracing for indirect lighting,
right?
Which I don't think Forza was doing. So it is probably going to be a bit heavier if it's using that. Saying Gibbs is a proprietary EA technology that leverages hardware ray tracing for indirect lighting. This turnkey solution allows artists to realize their vision, as Gibbs requires no pre-computation, no special meshes, and no unique UV sets. 150 stadiums brought to life with the help of innovative technology like Gibbs. So they're talking about it here as a time-consuming process that's basically been freed up for the developers. So I'm kind of, interested to see how it's going to pan out for FC25.
FC25, yeah.
Because if they're essentially giving you the option to turn it on and off, that suggests that there's two different approaches being used at the development level. I'm just sort of going back to that quote from the IGN article. It is still a bit unclear. I mean, it makes no sense for Frostbite to develop two different ray tracing systems for two different sports games.
Yeah.
So Occam's razor suggests that it's going to be Gibbs, right?
Yeah,
but
it does.
I was trying to sort of pick apart what they would mean by we'll have ray traced and occlusion. I was thinking it might have been a misquote of
ambient.
Ray traced ambient occlusion. Does that fit in with the Gibbs system? Possibly.
I mean, GI and AO have a relationship in how they shade and light an area with ray tracing, so it could be misinterpretation or something like that. It would make sense. I mean, it makes sense that it's been debuted here and then it would appear in FC25, but
the rest of the quote is actually quite a bit more illuminating. We'll have full cloth simulation on the jersey and the shorts during gameplay, self-shadowing at all times during the day, rim lighting on the players. So what that does is the close-up shots will really punch out from the background to give you more depth to the frame. And then we'll have 3D pitch divots and puddles as well, particularly with shadowing. We see the shadowing on the pitch, on the player, even in the crowd. We see that impact of the shadows there. Looking at favor resolution, we have cloth sim on the shorts only during gameplay, and self-shadowing is only available during the day. So that's quite interesting, right? It doesn't sound like they're shutting down a lot of the systems, just some of them.
Some of them. Whether I don't know if that'll be jarring or not. If it's just the shorts, is it, that have physics? Or do they shut that down?
Cloth simulation, yeah.
Yeah. That'd be wild. I mean, it might look a little bit strange, but I mean, by their judgment, if it works and it looks okay, and that's a good sacrifice to make, then that's fair enough as a concession to get there.
Yeah.
Also, I kind of feel like it's an interesting game type to make a debut for ray tracing features in sports games. You know, we're talking about a game where there's a fixed time of day. You set the time of day at the start of the game, and it kind of feels like it's something that would really be better shown off with the dynamic time of day, you know, especially GI. But in another way, it's like a perfect test case scenario where you've got a very contained area where you can just sort of throw whatever you want and experiment with these new technologies, like a stadium. So that kind of makes sense. Also, with FIFA, the fact that, to go back to your point about the fact there's two modes, like there's the ones with baked lighting that they've used in the past and the ray tracing mode, it makes sense because they've got a legacy of working with more baked lighting solutions, whereas they can switch that off and defer to the ray tracing version. Whereas with college football, I believe this is the first game they've had in the series in 10 years. It's the kind of comeback since NCAA 15. So they've got a lot of stadiums here. I'm not sure if there's an overlap with NFL, but certainly is a fresh start.
They've mentioned in PR that you'll be, I'm pretty sure this is for FC25, by the way, that you'll be able to start a game, at sunset, for example, and then it'll get gradually darker. And I guess at some point the floodlights will come on. So I guess at some level, the GI system needs to work in both modes, because you can't have that in one mode and not in the other.
That's very true.
Unless they just cycle through bakes, of course, which is an option. So what can I say? We have to see it in action. But what are your thoughts just on college football generally with this technology?
I've got to be honest. This is not my wheelhouse. I jumped in. I've always, I understand there's hugely popular games, but playing, and this is maybe the first NFL type game, American football style game I've played. This
but obviously
you
can judge the technology, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, but it was just kind of marveling at playing it and just thinking, gosh, I have no idea what's going on. And you can maybe see that in the footage that I've sent over. It's very stop-start, and I'm used to fluid play going from end to end. But Yeah, very. I mean, it's very cool, and it's the fact it's only developed for PS5, Series X, and S is an interesting move, and it shows that they're forward thinking now with Frostbite for sports titles. I thought the materials looked great. I thought the opening cutscenes were like full on, like just looked incredible. There's a real air of drama and cinematic spectacle about the game as well. I don't know if this is true of actual college football, but the theme tune that runs in the background of this game is just so dramatic. And then obviously you got the sort of cheerleaders and all the celebrations around, all the phenomenon that goes around American football. So I was very impressed by the tech of the game, and great way to kind of demo it ahead of FC25 when that launches.
Okay. Oliver, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think, at least judging from what they're showing off here, it does look pretty interesting and potentially quite compelling. I do wonder what it means for the last gen and Switch versions of the FC title, though, because it is shipping on PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Switch, I believe. Like, I presume they could be using this new tech to bake out lighting for the older versions, or they could just be scrapping pre-computed GI entirely. I kind of think the latter, but I've not seen one of these games in ages, so I don't know what they were using previously and exactly how effective that was. Maybe they didn't really have any solution, who knows? But I would be
Are you a fan of these games at all?
Oh boy, yeah, no. No, not really.
No, okay.
No. But I would be interested to see what that generational divide looks like, and also what this means for the resolution and image quality of the actual gameplay. Because, like you guys were discussing, in these sports games, they often do target very high native resolutions. That seems to be a trend.
Yeah.
Targeting native 4K with this variety of ray tracing, it's not likely. So do they lean on an upscaler? Do they just eat a softer image? I think those are reasonable choices. I don't think you need a native 4K 60 for a game like this. I think you can easily go by with something a little bit less ambitious if you're delivering better visual features, for sure. But it'll be interesting to see how they approach that.
Yeah, I mean, famously, they've never really, with the FIFA titles at least, sort of chased the state of the art. I remember we were looking at FIFA on PS4 Pro and Xbox One X, and both ran at 4K 60. They were pretty much the same, despite this massive divide in GPU power between the two consoles. But it does look as though they're leaning into more cutting-edge features now. And do you have any particular issues with the image quality in college football?
There are a couple of things. 1440p is fine. It's very, very workable. But I mean, there's only so far they can push that. I think more than most games, and it's true of broadcast football in terms of content, 4K shows the benefit of, you see the clarity of the players. You can see the names on the back of the shirts. It makes the most best use case for 4K resolution, which was why I think they went for it in FIFA and FC25. So drop to 1440p. I did notice, but I was always wondering, why is it a little soft? But it was never a huge bother. And in terms of the game itself, just a kind of side note, I think the texture filtering is also a little bit off, because when you see it at a side angle, as you do in this game, rather than FIFA's top-down angle, the AF anisotropic filtering quality really sort of stands out, whatever setting they're using there. So it's a small thing to fix, but it does stick out. But yeah, otherwise, I think 1440p is a fine resolution to target, as long as they're not chipping away too much into that to make way for new features. I think that's okay.
Okay, good stuff. All right, with that, let's move on. Okay, so it looks as though PlayStation VR 2, which is a PlayStation 5 only headset right now, is set to receive its support for PC imminently. There's an adapter coming out. Looks like I've seen some people on YouTube have already got it somehow and are testing it out. There's going to be an app for Steam as well to make the headset compatible with Steam VR, I suspect. And what's happening now is that all of this is happening in concert with a price cut for the headset. So, it's been as low as £330 in the UK. That's obviously the full complete set with the controllers as well. The adapter is coming soon for £50, and it looks as though it's being accompanied by a pretty big uptick in sales, which is great, potentially. Oliver, I'm going to come to you on this one. What do you make of all of this? I think ultimately Sony has to reduce the price of the headset for two reasons. First of all, it's not selling, obviously. Secondly, in the PC space, there is a major player there, Meta, with the MetaQuest headsets, which are very, very attractively priced, and of course work as standalone units. So in a sense, to become more competitive, PSVR 2 has to have that price cut, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very positive, the price cut. You have to wonder what hardware adoption might have looked like if this had been the price out of the gate. Obviously, that's probably not feasible. With respect to the MetaQuest headsets, I think it's a bit of an uphill battle because the Quest is so good as an independent headset. And the actual quality of the Quest display, when you compare it against PSVR 2, you're losing the HDR support on PC, right? So that's a huge advantage that you're losing. And in that case, I think John would certainly agree that the MetaQuest display is better in that case because you're getting that really nice low persistence and it looks pretty good. Obviously, you're losing out on the perfect blacks of the PSVR 2, but at least that advantage is gone. So it's probably not that big of a deal to step over to MetaQuest 3 at the least. But this price deal does seem to be region specific. I checked in Canada and it's still $820.
Okay,
Canadian.
Right. So no immediate plans to purchase.
No, well, I have one, but
okay,
yeah, but I don't know. I mean, I haven't used mine in certainly this year. I haven't used it, and I'm just assuming it's kind of a dying platform because there's not very much first party support. I mean, it's like Horizon GT7 and a game called Firewall Ultra. And I think there was a report that said there might be one or two more games from Sony itself, but nothing huge. I think the upcoming lineup looks weak, even relative to the original PSVR, which did not see the most compelling lineup. There was some like little gems in there, like I think the port of Doom 3 was pretty fun, even towards the end of that platform's life cycle. But certainly here you aren't really seeing too much that's like really interesting, and I just can't imagine this thing having that much of an exciting lineup into 2025 or 2026. So it's just, I think they're in a tough situation. I think it's probably better to just say, here's an option to play on PC. Here's a bit of a price cut to clear out some inventory, and that's that. So I don't know what they'll do with it in the future. It's a bit of an awkward situation, but I don't think it's seen that level of market permeation that is actually going to lead to some really compelling PSVR 2 software. I just think it's not there.
Yeah, I agree. It's been a really bizarre sort of situation to release a headset that is actually really, really good, but then not really support it. I mean, there are some standout experiences on there, like Gran Turismo, for example. But you're right, Oliver. The first party support just hasn't been there. There has been some interesting stuff from Capcom with ports for Resident Evil and whatnot, but it does feel like we're overall getting less support for this than PSVR 1, which in turn didn't actually do great for Sony. I don't know what to make of this. Is it the beginning of a resurgence for PSVR 2, or is it simply a way to manage the decline? And effectively end of life the product just by making sure what they've made gets out there into as many different hands as possible, and possibly maybe get some PC users possibly to sample PS5 if there's some extra games there they can try out while also enjoying it on their PCs. Yeah, it's an uphill struggle for them because obviously it's a wired solution as well, whereas you can go wireless with MetaQuest on its PC support. It's wireless anyway because it's an entirely independent system for its own internal titles. So it's a bit of an uphill struggle. We do need to check out this adapter though, and I'd love for John just to do, even just a hands-on video to see what he thinks of it. But I think, he's pretty much in the MetaQuest camp at this point, even though it does have those OLED displays. He's been talking a lot about motion clarity as well on the MetaQuest side of things. Tom, I'm not even sure if you've played PSVR 2 at all, but curious if you've got any thoughts on this.
No, I'm looking at it as an outsider, really, but I think the writing was on the wall when the sales were as low as they were, and the lack of games, the content wasn't forthcoming. It kind of feels like a catch-22 chicken and egg situation where, the developers needed to be, the third-party developers needed to see the sales, but the sales weren't very high to begin with. So really it's on Sony to have been there to push forward with a lot of solid first-party efforts and support for it, which hasn't been forthcoming either. So it's been a very strange project, especially like to see from the sidelines. Like I was actually thinking of getting one myself because I was so excited. I think it was during a slightly quiet stretch in the gaming schedule when it was released, and I was thinking, yeah, I could get into PSVR 2. That could be fun. And then I looked at what was actually on there, supported, and I thought, nothing. I don't have anything to go on here. And that's remained the case pretty much since, I just to justify the price. Now, when it comes to PC, I think the fact that the value proposition of buying a headset with all that hardware in, the eye tracking, the sort of haptic feedback and all the rest, and the HDR support, to not have those features enabled on PC and to then have to pay a further like $60 to access this hardware feels like a poor proposition to me. Like, it'll be great for the dev scene, I think, for people to get their hands on it, and maybe there will be an audience that developers that want to support PSVR 2, they can tap into a larger audience on PC and justify the costs of producing it for that way. But it does seem, like it's too little too late on several fronts. The price drop and the PC support should have been there day one, and it would have made a big difference, I think.
Right. Yeah, I'm not sure it's great news for PSVR 2 beyond the fact that you can play it on a PC and therefore have access to more games if you already own one. It's tricky. And also, some of these features that are supported on PSVR, they're not insignificant to implement. The foveated rendering, for example, we've been seeing some quite open posting from Hello Games' Martin Griffiths recently, and they spent months on adding foveated rendering to No Man's Sky for the PSVR 2. And, they're thrilled with the results, but obviously the amount of investment it took to get there was quite significant. We're going to check it out, I guess. We'll see how PSVR 2 works on PC. We'll get an idea, hopefully from John, as to, whether his feelings about MetaQuest as being the best price versus performing headset for PC is going to remain the case. I guess that's all we can really say about that one for now. So let's move on. Okay, so Visions of Mana is coming soon. A brand new entry for a classic series there. There's a demo out, and Tom's taken a look at it. Thoughts, Tom?
Yes, it's from Uka Studio, which interestingly is a subsidiary of NetEase, who we just covered a recent game of theirs, Marvel Rivals. Interesting. So PS5, Series X, and a PC release as well. And bizarrely, there's just one last-gen version on the PS4. There's no Xbox equivalent there. This series goes way back, and it's been a couple of years since the last one. Obviously, Secret of Mana was the big game I think a lot of people were exposed to in the Seiken Densetsu series, as it's known in Japan, back in '93. And the thing that made this series interesting, well, for that game in particular, was it was the sort of real-time, action, real-time combat game where Squaresoft was better known for its turn-based games at the time, Final Fantasy. And it also had a extra trick up its sleeve in the form of a 3-player co-op on SNES, which was quite interesting for the time. So flash forward, 31 years since then, and it's an Unreal Engine 5 take on the idea. It's a single-player game now. You switch between 3 characters, but the art style is kind of in line with that. There's some beautiful concept art that's realized on Unreal Engine 5. Great-looking anime-style models with flowing hair and like wind flowing through the trees. And this sample, this trial, I tried on Series X and S. It's kind of taking you through this frosty area. You've got platforming, you've got combat. It's a good sample of what's to come. I guess it is kind of it is a trial. There is a demo. We're going to get the full thing on August 29th, but you get two modes on Series X. Both are unlocked to 60 frames per second. The performance mode is 1080p native, and the quality mode is 1440p. No visual differences otherwise. And the thing is, the quality mode just doesn't have a 30 FPS cap. That's the big criticism here. It's just sort of wavering up and down between 35 and 60. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's 30 in cutscenes either way, but yeah, the only way you're getting to a locked 60 is, and I think it does make sense for the combat, is to run at performance mode on at 1080p.
Right.
And even then, there are kind of occasional drops. I checked out the Series S version as well. In that one, it seems a bit more dynamic, and there's just one mode. It's just it's unlocked to 60. It's 1080p to 1260p, but because it's unlocked to 60 FPS, you only really get there when you look right at the sky. And anything like actually in game, you're just kind of wavering between 30 and 35 FPS. So it's just another case you just need a 30 FPS cap there. I think the only other thing to say is that Series S has some dropped shadows and LODs on shadows as well, dropped shadow quality. But otherwise, it looks really good on all, both platforms. Very stylish, great looking game with these sort of semi-open areas like Dust Bowl areas where you explore and engage in combat. So interesting kind of return for the series. And did you check this out, either of you?
I checked it out on PC. I can't say I was hugely impressed with the stuttering in there that I saw, but I only just quickly played it for a few moments. But we do have this supporter comment from Killer Fugu. Hope all are well. How is the state of Unreal Engine games on DX12? They're known for stutters, both shader and traversal, yet devs don't seem to be hearing this. The demo for the newest Mana game came out. I was excited to try it, but the first cutscene is locked to 30 FPS. There's massive frame drops whenever the camera transitions. This is true, I noticed that. And then when you get into gameplay, the stutters were horrific, with massive frame time spikes. I saw my FPS dip from 160 to 80, and the second combat was the same, as it was different enemies and effects, so presumably more shader compilation. Surely this stuff is well documented enough at this point. There was no shader compilation step at all on boot up, which seems like it could have easily solved this, as the game runs fine once you get past the initial butchery. This isn't going to be an issue that's going to be noticeable on consoles, I suspect, because the shaders are all pre-compiled. But what about the cutscene stutter transition? Was that fine on you, or for you on the consoles?
It was. So I think it's another case of it points to the shader compilation issue being in the domain of PC, where they've got to uncompile the assets on the fly, where it's all already kind of set on the console front. So it was a Fluid 30 in the cutscenes. So they are able to achieve a 30 FPS cap and do it stutter free on console. So
right, okay, but they just don't want to do it in gameplay.
They want to, for whatever reason. They had high aspirations. They thought, we can do it, and then actually...
It's a really attractive game, to be fair, on PC still. I played it at 4K on a 4080. Didn't seem to have a huge amount of options. Interestingly, you boot it, and it says, do you want to favour image quality or resolution? Sorry, image quality or frame rate. It's like, this is a PC game. Let me choose in the options menu. And, there are 3 different settings there, but it's all very, very nondescript. Oliver, did you check this out?
I did. I played it for a few minutes. I think it looks good. I think it looks pretty good. It's pretty cross-gen. It's using UE. I don't know if they're using UE4, UE5, but if they are using 5, they aren't using the feature set, really. There's no Lumen, NI, VSMs, whatever.
Yeah.
But it does look... like, it looks nice for what it is. I mean, I always thought the trailers looked good. in motion, during gameplay, it's maybe not quite as compelling as like some of those big cinematic moments. The combat didn't grip me quite as much as a game like, let's say, Tales of Arise, which has a kind of similar art style and a similar kind of party-based combat system. But I'm interested to see the full game. I'm not as excited with some of the performance options. Like you said, Tom, the Xbox version does seem to have some performance issues, even though it's like 1440p 60, which seems pretty reasonable for a game of this caliber. But I guess we'll have to wait and see for the final code. In terms of how the PC demo works, I mean, I don't think it portends anything that good for the final game, but I also don't think it's the end of the world if your demo has some comp stutters. It's
that's true.
I mean, it's a bad first impression for sure, but it is a demo. I'm not exactly sure how to score that one. I think it's reasonable.
You got to wait for final code, but it does raise red flags.
Exactly. Sure. I would agree with that for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the August 29th when we'll find out about that.
Okay, good stuff. Let's move on to our next news topic. So last week, the Asus ROG Ally X launched. $799 handheld. It has a number of advantages over the existing ROG Ally, specifically faster memory, much bigger battery, and completely redesigned internals, even though it does have essentially the same Z1 Extreme processor. We haven't reviewed it. The preview that we've got basically tells you all you need to know because, extra memory is great. Actually, that's the key thing, really. Extra memory. There's some games that are coming out now, specifically like Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, which really do require the extra memory. The 16 gigs in the standard Ally, not enough. Ally X at 24 basically solves the problem. What was missing from our preview, hands-on, was the fact that we couldn't show our benchmarks. So we can do that now. Even though this was from an engineering sample unit, I strongly suspect that these will be indicative of the final retail unit. Going to kick off with Cyberpunk 2077. The faster memory basically gives a 4.1% advantage to that over the existing Ally running upscale 1080p at 25 watts. Forza Horizon, this one typically doesn't scale amazingly well with the faster memory, but even so, here we're seeing a 5.6% advantage, which is obviously a nice thing to have. Let's look at A Plague Tale Requiem. The benchmark sequence, another 5.4% there, which is great. And what can I say? Let's move on to the final one, Marvel's Spider-Man. Historically, this one has been very friendly with memory bandwidth, and it is the case here. The Ally X delivering 8.2% of extra performance in the initial intro scene compared to the original Ally. So even without the additional memory, faster memory just gives an advantage there. So there's a lot to love about the Ally X, I think principally because the Ally with its VRR screen effectively made it the default choice for handheld gaming, I think, on the PC space, beyond Steam Deck. If you needed a Windows handheld, the Ally was the place to be. Ally X just solves all of the problems I had with the Ally. Bigger battery, you can actually use it for a meaningful amount of time. And it's just a really, really nice piece of kit. Still got the VRR screen that none of the competitors have. Isn't OLED, but it's just pretty great. So Oliver, with all of this now out in the open, as an Asus ROG Ally owner, do you consider this as a worthy upgrade, or are you happy with your Ally?
I think it looks compelling. Probably the aspect of it that I would be most interested in is just the additional grips on the back. You got to think an extra 5 millimeters of clearance in the grips. It looks more comfortable.
Yes.
Because the existing ROG Ally, it's got like some slightly sharp corners to it, and the degree of protrusion of those back handle surfaces is not so much. If you compare it to something like the Steam Deck is far deeper and gives you that more comfortable experience. And personally, I think when you're talking about lugging like a 7-inch device around with you, I think that extra depth to the device is not that big of a deal, at least to me. So I think that's what, I think they could go further with it. But the enhanced,
it's heavier as well because of the bigger battery.
Yeah, the bigger battery is certainly interesting as well. I wouldn't say I'm enticed. Like, to me, I kind of really want something that is combining the parts of the Steam Deck that I really like and the parts of the ROG Ally that I really like. And this is kind of a halfway step. Like, I really want something with an OLED screen, VRR, very comfortable grips, just like hitting it out of the park in all these respects. And to me, so far, there's no device really like that. Maybe the Steam Deck OLED comes close.
Yeah.
But in this case, in these benchmarks, it does just seem like you get a little bit more memory bandwidth. Certainly the Phoenix Point APU can use a little bit more memory bandwidth. That certainly helps. And there's a bit of an advantage there, but nothing that's revelatory. And indeed, until we see like I think we'll see the Strix Point APUs possibly in these devices at some point. That does seem, from the early benchmarks that we've seen over the past few days, does seem faster. But in the interim, it's just going to be these like little tweaks, like, oh, are you running your Z1 Extreme, your 7840U, your 8840U, whatever you want to call it, your Phoenix Point with 7500 megahertz RAM or 6400 megahertz RAM? And it's going to be these like little tweaks here and there that differentiate the performance between the devices. But it's not actually that meaningful in the end.
The extra memory, though, I think it is going to become increasingly more important.
Yeah.
For sure, because it just seems to be the the mantra of the PC space is that generally over time there's bloat and games make use of the extra bloat. It's generally considered now that you should probably have 32 gigs of system RAM in your desktop PC. So there's games like Alan Wake that initially wouldn't. Actually, no, that's not strictly true. It was a problem with the Ally because it was sharing 16 gigs of memory between graphics and system memory, and it needed initially I think 8 gigs for VRAM and 12 gigs or 16 gigs for system RAM. They've tweaked that now. It's 6 and 10 rather, so you can just about do it. But then you look at Avatar, and I just couldn't get that to work properly on the basic Ally, no matter what RAM configuration I used. But the Ally X just basically solves that. So I think it's a really nice upgrade. But I think you're quite right in that there are things that you just kind of want from a newer iteration of the machine, that being more performance and a better screen. And for whatever reasons, they couldn't quite pull that off. I'm really going to be interested to see if Strix Point actually ends up in these handhelds, because obviously it's got a sizable AI component in there. The MPU is going to be occupying a lot of die space. So, is it actually viable for these handheld manufacturers to make one at an agreeable price point? Guess we'll just have to find out. But in the meantime, I honestly do think the ROG Ally X is the best Windows handheld out there. But it's still very, very separate from the Steam Deck, which the Steam Deck OLED, which just does so many things in so many fantastic ways that it's almost like a different device in a way, despite the fact they are both x86-based handhelds. But yes, I do think it is the best Windows-based handheld, and it's certainly the cheapest one that's got more than 16 gigs of memory. The only other ones are the Chinese-based handhelds, which seem to A, have 32 gigs, and B, are priced in a significantly extravagant manner. Okay, let's move on to the next news topic. Okay, so this week, AMD put out a new technical preview for its Fluid Motion Frame technology. AFMF is now AFMF2. And I took a look at it. I was quite impressed by it. Basically you have to download a bespoke driver in order to access the new feature. And then, it basically just sits within the Radeon sort of control panel, and you can activate it at will. And obviously you can access that control panel at any time, I think, with Alt-R. There's also, when you boot a game, there's a little flash in the top right-hand corner, which tells you which of the Radeon features are active. So let's quickly talk about what AFMF and AFMF2 actually are and why it's quite exciting. Basically, this is driver level frame generation, which means that in theory it should work on any, I think it's DX11, DX12, it might have been backported, I'm not sure, but definitely all modern games on DX11 and DX12 support AFMF2, and this is driver level frame generation. No integration needed by developer. It kind of just, in theory, works. Now, I had some issues with the original AFMF, which is to say that in areas of really fast motion, it just seemed to turn off. Presumably because the image quality of interpolating between two very fast moving frames wasn't great, so they kind of just turned it off. This produced a sort of jarring effect. I played a series of games with AFMF2 using a Radeon RX 7900 GRE, which is kind of like upper mid-range. I was playing at 4K on Control, Cyberpunk, and what was the other game I did? Let's have a quick
Hellblade.
Look. Hellblade, yes. Well done, Oliver. Now, here's the footage that I captured. What's interesting about this is that in the bottom right-hand corner there, you'll see RivaTuner Statistics Server's frame rate counter. RivaTuner is not aware of anything that AFMF is doing, so it's reporting the base frame rate, right? Now, in the top right-hand corner there, you've got the Radeon overlay, which does accurately track frame rate with AFMF active. So you basically see at the bottom right there, base frame rate, top right, interpolated frame rate with AFMF. And, you are seeing a really appreciable multiplier there. It is typically in the 2x range. Question is, does the image quality hold up? And the other question, of course, is, does it, did I notice it turning off at all, which was not great. It doesn't seem to turn off now. It seems to work. It seems to look really good. And you're always getting this multiplier. And for slower paced games like Hellblade 2, I mean, AMD, I think they really want you to have as high a base frame rate as possible, so the artifacts in interpolated frames don't show up. However, slower paced games like Hellblade, I'm running it sort of in the mid-40s here on the 7900 GRE. This is essentially maxed out settings, 4K output, upscaling from 1440p. And, what can I say? AFMF2 is taking you into high refresh rate territory. Looks great on my screen. And because it's a slower pace game, the lower base frame rate doesn't seem to have too much of an issue. Next game I looked at, Control. This one is quite interesting because the 7900 GRE here, I could run with medium settings, but I turned off MSAA. It's not needed. And I just used the full RT feature set. And I could play this anything from 100 to 120 frames per second with the GRE, which is a great turnout for a upper mid-range GPU. Full ray tracing there, everything there. And what can I say? You can see the base frame rate there. I managed to keep it in the 60 territory. It does go a bit lower into the 50s. But, on a VRR screen, worked great. Cyberpunk, same thing. Here I'm just using flat ultra settings, I believe. And again, the frame rate can be sort of 40s. Just works really well in the high refresh rate territory. Next thing I did was, because this technology basically relies on VSync being off, I don't think you can use it with VSync on. What I used was RivaTuner Statistics Server to limit frame rate to about 57 to 58 FPS. So once AFMF activates, it's always going to be in the VRR window of my LG OLED. It will always be slightly under 120 frames per second. And that worked. So yeah, what can I say? I think the quality is pretty good. The frame rate multiplier is pretty consistent, looks great. Question is visual inconsistencies. In Control, I did notice them, specifically on the kind of HUD elements, like the target reticule in the middle of the screen. Fast movement has some issues there. But it wasn't enough for me to say, right, this is awful, I'm going to turn it off. I thought it was still pretty good. I've shared my assets with you guys. Oliver, any initial thoughts about this? I recognise that obviously you're just looking at my footage, haven't had the opportunity to play it at all. But,
Yeah.
quality of frame gen, I think it's all right.
I think it looks pretty good, I think not disabling it during fast movement is the right call. I would rather live with frame gen artifacts than just have that obvious difference in fluidity from one moment to the other. I think that's a more obtrusive issue. If you look through individual frames, you do find issues, and it's not like it's not like it was with FSR3 or like DLSS 3 frame generation, where you can go through and actually find frames, many frames indeed, that are generated frames that you will know are generated frames, but don't exhibit substantial artifacts. They can still look quite good, surprisingly good. Here, that's not the case. They tend to exhibit very, very obvious artifacts. But in motion, it looks okay. It looks all right. Certainly the issues with the HUD elements, like you mentioned, that is a bit of a problem because you are just running this as like a post-process based off the, game image. So that's not ideal, but it seems all right. I guess I would kind of have a more philosophical question, which is that I wonder what the utility of bringing a game to 60 or from 60 to 120 if you don't have a motion vector based frame gen technique, because it seems like 60 FPS, especially with motion blur, it's already delivering a pretty smooth experience. Yeah. And it is a sort of interesting trade-off with frame gen where as it becomes more viable with a high base frame rate, it becomes arguably less useful. And with AFMF, I think here, maybe to me, at least judging from these results now, of course, I haven't played it myself, but just scrolling through this footage and watching it, I think to me, I would kind of lean towards, well, maybe we'll just keep it at 60 and just live with a little bit of, not quite the same level of smoothness, but have a perceptibly cleaner image and motion.
Yeah, I think, when you're dealing with a variable frame rate, I think it does have its advantages there. Right. Because it's not, you're not always locked 60, are you? Certainly in this footage, you can see in control, for example, I'm going between 50 to 60 in some cases, which basically results in like 100 to 120. And I'd kind of much rather be in 100 to 120 even with the artifacts. Right. I think it's a really interesting technology. But I think what's cool about it is, you don't need to use it. It's just a value added feature, and it might be, there will be variable results on each game, but, tailor your settings correctly. And you are always in the high refresh rate range, which for me, I think is really good. It's a good thing to have if you've got that display, and it is kind of like a fallback in a sense. But, I was just thinking about Alex's lossless scaling video where he's looking at the frame generation there. I'd say that the quality here is better. And there are going to be use cases where, it holds up even on lower base frame rates. So I think, overall it's a net win. Did you look at the assets sent over there, Tom?
I did, yes. And it was nice having you narrate over the top of them while I looked at them just now again. So yeah, it is handy, as you say, for a 45 FPS base to go up to 90. That's inherently useful. I think there's a net win overall. That target reticle, I noticed in control especially. Did you notice it? I mean, I'm going frame by frame in this, but did you notice it like while playing? Was it intrusive at all, or do you think it's
You notice
passable?
it for sure. There's no doubt about it. It's on really sort of fast whip pans where you can see that it's just there. The issue with frame generation, I mean, the reason this works at all is because, you're sandwiching interpolated frames in between standard rendered frames. It's the same with all frame generation technologies. It produces like a strobe effect where basically it makes the artifacts harder to pick up because, the persistence of the interpolated frames is pretty short. So, I just found it a really interesting technology that enables you to get more out of a higher refresh rate display. And I think it works quite nicely. There are going to be instances where it doesn't work. And it's not going to sort of hold up to the same sort of scrutiny that DLSS 3 and FSR 3 frame generation do, because they're inherently given much more to work with. But, there's a whole bunch of games out there that are never going to receive frame generation technology. And, there are some interesting use cases that Alex highlighted in the lossless scaling video. For example, emulators. It will work on those, assuming they work with the correct APIs. He was showing Killzone 2 on the PS3 emulator running at 120, which, it's never going to happen otherwise, I wouldn't have thought. So there are really interesting use case scenarios for this. And I don't think there's anything really to be worried about with this. It's something you can just experiment with and have fun with. And I do think it's a worthwhile feature. And I think NVIDIA needs to take a look at this and think to themselves, maybe we should be doing this too, not just, limiting it simply to DLSS 3 proper support. It's a whole library of games out there that could potentially benefit from this. I'm not sure it should be something that, is available in a console SDK that developers can lean into because, historically, FSR has kind of been used and abused as opposed to, there's as many bad implementations as there are good implementations. And, you'd worry that it would be used as a bit of a crutch. But, on the PC side where you're in control of your own experience, I think it's well worth checking out. And yes, I think NVIDIA should be thinking about doing something similar.
I would be very interested to see this on a device like the ROG Ally, where maybe, you get that VR display, obviously, that will help you out, but maybe you're dealing with lower input frame rates, maybe like 30 or 40 FPS in some of these games. Could that be an okay experience?
I ran out of time. The ROG Ally was right here. I was charging it up to try out. I did try AFMF 1 on it, and the fact that it kept turning off wasn't great. AMD has also added in some features here that make it more performant on lower end hardware, and I suspect they've got devices like that in mind. But obviously I suspect there'll be a quality hit if you're going into what is described as a performance mode. In fact, let's look at some of the notes from AMD here. AFMF2 features a new performance mode that reduces the overhead of AFMF2 to help make high frame rate gaming experiences more achievable on a wider range of devices, especially beneficial with integrated graphics cards. And it's now the supported auto setting on Ryzen processors with Radeon graphics. There's a lot of other things they've done here. They've lowered input lag with compared to AFMF1. And there's now support for borderless full screen mode. And it also supports games that use Vulkan and OpenGL. So there is increased API functionality there. So, what can I say? They've also added in interoperability with AMD Radeon Chill. So, what was initially an interesting feature, I now describe as a fascinating one. And definitely worth checking out if you've got a Radeon card. The technical preview is available to everyone, but it is like a branch of the existing drivers. And with that, let's move on. Okay, final news story of the week. There's been some issues, obviously, at Bungie this week, and lots of layoffs, and feel really bad about that as usual. In the wake of that, there's been some news about what's happening internally at Bungie. We do now seemingly have confirmation that Destiny 3 just isn't happening. Either it was cancelled or it's not in development to begin with, which kind of raises the question of what's actually happening at Bungie. Oliver, you've looked into this, right?
Yeah, I think this is really unfortunate. It seems like there was a spin-off that was in development, and then it wasn't in development. I guess it was canceled, and then some key staff have left, like Luke Smith, who was the director of Destiny 2. I don't feel that great about it, because even though they are continuing with Destiny 2, I think the technical foundations of Destiny 2 aren't amazing. Obviously, the graphics have aged somewhat over the last 7 years. I don't think like the materials like that great, and lighting could use a rework, and there are all kinds of things you could point at and say this is not quite up to current gen spec. But I think maybe the bigger issue, at least historically, maybe not going forward as much, but historically, has been some of the content production restrictions that they've had to work with, because Destiny 2 at the moment basically consists of a few expansions that have been released since 2019. All the game content prior to roughly 2019 has been deleted, including the original campaign. I think they said that they would be cycling old content back into the game, but this has not occurred yet. And it basically means that as soon as you log in, you're like max level because they deleted all that original content. Like a huge chunk of the game, it's all gone. And I do understand that MMOs are massive, and it's probably true that no MMO style game has quite the production values that Destiny does. But if you look at other MMO style games like World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy XIV, they just don't delete large segments of game content to free up storage space or to help alleviate the burden on some of their older systems. Like right now in World of Warcraft, you can play every single expansion they've ever released with some content dating back 20 years to 2004. And I think, like, you kind of think, well, a Destiny 3 project that could have provided a real opportunity for a reset, and maybe if they could overcome the technical hurdles, which must be numerous and very substantial, a chance to rework existing Destiny 1 and Destiny 2 content to maybe work within a third game, possibly with something like asset streaming to keep those storage sizes a little bit more in check. Asset streaming for the internet, I mean. And that's a hard question, but it's kind of a little bit weird that they didn't really have a good technical solution, it seems like, for maintaining the actual live service aspect of the game. And that's a little bit weird and unfortunate. So I think, like, as far as the current game content goes, people do seem satisfied with it. I think there's some reporting that's just going forward. The solution will be to deliver fewer of these bigger updates, maybe no more big updates for the game, no more big expansions, some smaller pieces of content. I personally haven't played it in a few years, but I don't know. The whole thing leaves a bit of a bad taste in the mouth because I was really expecting to come back in, play some like Destiny 3 in a few years. I really expect them to iterate on this. I think maybe it's not a slam dunk, but certainly it would get people back in and interested. And instead it seems like, Bungie had some layoffs, obviously, recently. It seems like some developers from Bungie are moving to a new studio within Sony Interactive Entertainment to develop a new IP. There are some developers on Marathon, and then maybe there's some developers on a new project that we don't know about, or they're going to iterate some new ideas for new projects and try to work on something because they still have, I think 800 staff or something. It's a pretty sizable studio even still with the layoffs. So, I don't know. I think it's just unfortunate. I wish they had gone in a different direction, but I also understand that the financial realities of Destiny 2 right now are maybe not the most favorable to continuing extensive development in that title. So it probably does make sense.
Yeah, it was a slightly odd way to announce that they're developing a new studio and a new franchise, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Slightly bizarre. Yeah, I'm curious how this is all going to pan out in terms of, the management structure, because, the impression was that Bungie would remain independent when it was acquired by Sony, but now we're seeing this sort of much bigger integration, seemingly. I'm also sort of entirely unclear as to what the future of Destiny is at this point. Obviously, that we know they've got Marathon coming as well, but what's the studio up to more generally? There's it's a bit of a mystery. So Oliver, you're saying that the potential route forward for Destiny 2 is to kind of like they're going to continue producing new chapters for it, right?
They're going to continue to produce, it sounds like, smaller content expansions. But like up until now, roughly every year, they've been releasing like a big content expansion with new playable areas, new missions, new they call them strikes, new like little multiplayer missions to engage with your friends.
Okay.
But I think going forward, the expectation is that probably they won't be doing as much of that. Maybe they'll be recycling more old content. I mean, I'd love to see them bring back the content they deleted. That seems like a totally bizarre thing to me even still. But I'm not sure that, you think that there are fewer people in that project that have some technical expertise possibly to pull that off. So might not be the ideal time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, they did a huge amount of work with Destiny 2 in creating a really, impressive engine for the time. But we haven't really touched Destiny since launch, Destiny 2.
True. Yeah, there's been a lot of expansions since as well.
A lot of expansions, but I'm still thinking that the basic technical foundation is essentially the same. Maybe I'm wrong there. There's got to be some.
It looks very, very similar.
Right. Mm-hmm. Tom, you're not a Destiny guy.
Well, I have covered it in the past. It's been a long while, as you say, though. It's Yeah, it always felt like Destiny 2 was they were trying to polish up and make amends for certain design choices in the first game. And I always saw Destiny 2 as their kind of springboard for more content and more expansions that would last them out for a while. But it has been a while. I mean, when was Destiny 2? It was 2017. Yeah, it's been, I mean, 7 years is a good run, but yeah, it's approaching that time where people are looking at the new hardware and thinking, well, what would a Destiny look like on this, like built from scratch? Because I mean, going back to it, I have dipped in for comparisons. I forget which. I think it was a streaming comparison because Destiny 2 was available on like GeForce Now and a bunch of others, and
Stadia.
I was trying to get Stadia. And I was trying to get like matching footage with my legacy backups. And obviously a lot of the content, the sort of onboarding stuff has been changed and removed, and they've chopped and changed it to, make it a little bit different and streamline it. So yeah, that is a shame, but it's, we'll have to see what comes of Marathon. But it's a shame about Destiny in the here and now.
Okay, that's the end of the news, and therefore we shall be ploughing on directly into supporter Q&A. So every week on the DF supporter program on Patreon, I ask our supporters to suggest topics and questions for inclusion in the show. We choose the best, or rather the ones we're best equipped to answer. And we're going to kick off with this question from Leftist Hominid. Have you ever considered comparing in-home remote streaming performance between Steam Link, Xbox and PlayStation? Now, I'm going to put this question to Oliver, first of all, because I think the answer's probably no. We haven't considered this in the way that Leftist Hominid is suggesting. We've looked, obviously, at remote play and weren't too impressed by it. We've not looked at Xbox. However, Oliver, you've been getting into in-home streaming, and you're extremely happy with the results you've had with a particular setup, right?
Yeah, so I've been using a setup called Moonlight on my Steam Deck. It used two programs, one called Sunshine, which is for the host device, Moonlight for the client device. And it is an implementation, I believe, of an NVIDIA Shield streaming protocol that was developed a number of years ago. Yeah. And in that, if you set the bitrate reasonably high and you have your computer connected like via Ethernet, you can have your Steam Deck connected via Wi-Fi, but especially if you have your computer connected to your router via Ethernet, you can get excellent image quality and flawless frame pacing. Like the frame pacing is perfect, essentially. It's a very smooth 60 FPS or 90 FPS in my case in the Steam Deck. It does have a little bit of a hit to input lag, but as long as you're targeting higher frame rates, it's not too much of an issue. Like it feels perceptibly sort of like you're dealing with a game with frame generation in terms of the input lag. So it's like if you're dealing with a 60 FPS game that has frame gen, it's like more like a slightly laggier 30 FPS. That's roughly what it feels like to me. Might depend a little bit on the game, but in most games, it's usually workable. I think that would probably be better than the other options, judging from some of my experiences in the past. I've not tried some of the in-home remote streaming too much. I have tried Steam Link, and Steam Link is not as good as Moonlight, in my opinion. Not nearly as good as Moonlight,
no chance.
in my opinion. No. I just think it's a really, really, really good solution. That is, it's strikingly good. It's so good that like I really do reach for Moonlight before I reach for native play on my Steam Deck at the moment. It really is just something that I prefer. So yeah, it's a very compelling experience. But yeah, I would suspect that's probably better, judging from impressions online and judging from like what I've seen from Steam Link. It probably is better than those other solutions.
My question to you is, how do you actually sort of navigate to play the games that you want? Is it just like Steam Big Picture mode, or do you have Windows desktop access?
The way that I have it set up, it just streams to my desktop. So it just shows me whatever. And then you have the trackpads, right, to control the cursor input. You can hit the Steam Deck key, the Steam key, and X to bring up an on-screen keyboard. It is reasonably flexible and quite usable. Actually, I think it's more usable than something like a ROG Ally, which doesn't enjoy those trackpads, which I find very, very useful and indeed crucial to navigating in Windows. So it's a pretty manageable little experience. And in terms of the Steam Deck client itself for Moonlight, It has a Linux client. You boot into it in the desktop mode, you add it to Steam, right-click Add to Steam, then you switch back to gaming mode, and all of a sudden it's there like an app icon, like any other game that you would have loaded onto the Steam Deck before. So it's very straightforward, and Sunshine is just a breeze to set up as well. I just boot up my computer and it's automatically running, and it's a great experience. So yeah, it's very seamless, surprisingly seamless and surprisingly high quality. I really did not expect in particular frame pacing to be as good as it is.
Yeah, that's always been like the bête noire of it, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Does it support HDR?
I believe it does. I think it does support HDR. It does support HDR. Yeah, I haven't tried that out. I have not been playing games that support HDR natively, so I've not been trying that out, but it does support HDR, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Tom, let's go back to Leftist Hominid's question. Have you ever considered comparing in-home remote streaming performance between Steam Link, Xbox, and PlayStation? Do you think it's something we should look into?
Well, now I have, yeah. It's actually not a bad idea at all. I mean, it could. I have tried Steam Link, much like Oliver, and I know it's the same with Steam Remote Play. I'm not convinced they've got the technology set up really to do it effectively. But I haven't tried Xbox or PlayStation. Yeah, I'd like to give those something like that a go.
Okay, cool.
Remote streaming though is, yeah, I mean we have been critical of streaming in general from like a general server side, like from a company side to a client at home. But home to home streaming is kind of a different beast, and I think it's like picking your battles in terms of, like with Oliver, you're choosing to have the downsides of, say, the streaming issues that may be there or limited as they are, as opposed to worrying about having to optimize the Steam Deck, and get the game running well natively on the hardware. That's the sort of trade you're going for. It's a good one, I think. And I've been in this position several times where I've not had the ability to carry like my whole PC to a place. I've had like gatherings with friends up in a different place away from home. So what I've done is I've set up a PC at home with all my games set up, ready to go, Street Fighter 6, obviously, and beamed in via a streaming method. I use Parsec myself, and that's been, it's about 10% the effort for 90% of the reward, which right. I feel like is a fair trade for me. And I was thinking, just to get them playing Street Fighter for a bit, I'd have to haul my Mega Rig or my PS5 even up to New York, and I can just enjoy it and show them how the game works. There's lag, no doubt, but they had a good time with it. So yeah, I think streaming on our own terms with games that we own and are willing to tinker with in that way, it's a pretty good way to go.
Well, I'm going to be, I'm curious about this topic now, because the PlayStation remote play streaming, people are fine with it, but every objective test I've ever done with it has found it lacking. I'm curious if that's the same with Xbox, whether it's like an APU level thing. The problem does seem to be solved on PC though, with Moonlight, and certainly with the VR stuff. John's been talking about using wireless link with the MetaQuest, and we're talking about big bit rates there, and he's not worried at all about the latency and stuff like that. So, interesting stuff. Let's move on to this question from Steel from Work. Where the hell is the ray tracing update for Minecraft? Have you all heard any rumours about this? I'm surprised a graphics overhaul for the current generation of hardware wasn't a priority for Microsoft. There's a bit of history to this one. Obviously, there is a ray tracing upgrade for Minecraft, but it's only the PC version. Minecraft RTX. However, when John and I went to Seattle in 2020, March 2020, to check out Xbox Series X, one of the demos that we saw was a fully path-traced Minecraft. And it looked great. And this was like, 2020. It was the era before image reconstruction techniques, sufficiently sophisticated ones like FSR2 or whatnot were available. I think it was running at 1080p. And, performance was variable, but it was fine. So yes, Steel from Work. Yeah, I'm surprised a graphics overhaul for the current generation of hardware wasn't a priority for Microsoft, because it seems to be back in 2020. they talked about refactoring the work for Minecraft RTX, but so far we haven't seen anything. The exception to the rule was when a preview release for Minecraft on Xbox Series consoles, a kind of ROG preview update went up, and you could kind of hack in support for the ray tracing features. So they are there. I mean, they weren't running particularly well on Series S, from what I recall. And I dare say that, if you've got less curated content, as we had in that demo back in 2020, then performance would be hit, just as it is on Minecraft RTX. But it's baffling. Oliver, you got any thoughts on this? Because Steel from Work is saying here, have you heard any rumors about this? Well, no, I haven't. Maybe next time I speak to someone from maybe next time I speak to someone from Microsoft, we can try and nail this down. But that's kind of the state of play at the moment. I just don't know why. Any particular theories you might have?
Yeah, I don't really know what the key impediment is, because it did seem to run all right, or at least serviceably well in 2020. Obviously, there have been a lot of developments in upskilling technology since then, so you presume that performance could be improved further, significantly further. Yeah. I don't really understand what the central concern is, but I do think that sometimes with projects like these, especially within like really big studios, sometimes the reasoning for these projects not shipping is just like, well, we weren't happy with image quality. We wanted it to be pristine. The existing game looks pristine. It looks super sharp. We can't get it up to that standard. Or like the Series S version doesn't look good enough, so we didn't ship it. They don't have to ship it. It's not a new game. It's an update to an existing one, so they can kind of make whatever choice they want to there. But sometimes I would think that the internal, I don't know, it might be fair to call it the internal politics of the situation, might just be evaluating this versus what they already have and working out if this is like the right way to present Minecraft to new players, or if this is something they should toggle on as like an experimental mode, or exactly what they should do. And there are also some validation questions. I've not played too much of Minecraft RTX and PC, so I don't know if they're like obvious points when the visuals just fail and it provides a markedly worse experience than the original game. I imagine visibility is better in the original game in some lighting conditions for sure. That could be a concern, but I think it's probably fine here if you do just toggle it on or off. So yeah, there could be a variety of questions there, but I don't think they come down to the hardware not being fast enough to run the title, because clearly the hardware is fast enough.
Tom?
Well, I'd like to play the optimist here and say that they're still waiting for a good opportunity to push it out with a bunch of other features. But yeah, it has been quite a while since we saw that the RTX version, and it is. I wonder how much of a demand there is for among the audience of Minecraft, given ray tracing.
That's a fair point. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's a fair point. If you've got like a console audience, then there is the suggestion that it's not like the dedicated hardcore PC audience that want the absolute maximum feature set from a PC game in order to fully exercise their components. Yeah, it's an interesting one. My current sort of theory on it is that maybe some content is just too challenging. There's going to be problems with Xbox Series S for sure, because it's just inherently far less capable. And to be fair, I'm not sure we've seen any other kind of path tracing game released in the last 4 years. So maybe this one was just filed under exploratory research. Good for a demo, maybe not good for a full release. Because it is fair to say that when it did sneak out into the open, people weren't particularly impressed with the performance level on Series S. Maybe it just required too much work, too much effort for too little reward. And in the meantime, if you want RT, the PC version's been there. It's always been there for a long time now. And it's great. So I guess that's possibly the solution. The explanation, rather. It's all a bit weird. This question comes from someone Just someone. Since PS4 and Xbox One, consoles have moved to more PC-like architectures, at least in terms of CPU, GPU, with some clear benefits, but arguably losing some of their distinctive factors for good or for bad. Do you think there's still space for consoles with bespoke hardware to push gaming technology in new and interesting ways? And even if there is not, is it something that you would ideally like to see? So, exotic consoles, Tom, what do you reckon?
Oh, we've learned our lesson, I think, since PS3. The Exotica that Cerny mentioned of the, regarding the cell processor. I think there's always something exciting about. I mean, we've covered, I think the PS3 360 sort of comparison was always very exciting for that specific reason, that there was this exotic element to the architecture. What could one console do that the other could not? And one had a Blu-ray player, one had a cell processor, the other had a more streamlined x86. It wasn't x86.
No, it was PowerPC, but it had a better. It just had better cross-platform. Credentials, much better GPU, unified memory. The list goes on.
Yeah, the split memory on PS5 set up so many woes for developers. It was that was an interesting time, but also an absolute nightmare for developers to navigate. And I'm sure that the quality of games on PS4, Xbox One onwards speaks to how easy it's been to develop, how easy it is to navigate between PS4 and PC. So yeah, in a way, I think we're set on this course. I mean, even Switch uses sort of parts that have been appropriated from other devices. It's the Shield tech essentially. And so it's part of a sort of a pipeline that we know already exists. I think there's value in just making facilitating development for developers easier. And that has been a winning formula. And it's true for where Sony is taking, the PS5 and like the PS5 Pro by the sounds of things. So,
Yeah, definitely. Oliver.
Yes. I mean, I still think there can be room for some interesting stuff on the consoles, some unique stuff. This isn't totally novel, but I do remember Mark Cerny talking, I think around the launch of the PS4, about an early PS4 concept that involved achieving an insane amount of bandwidth, like over a terabyte per second,
right?
Using some EDRAM, combining traditional memory with a big pool of EDRAM. That's not completely out of left field because consoles have used similar technologies in the past. But that is the kind of thing you'd probably only see on a console, and probably you would only get from significant buy-in on a console platform from developers who are building their titles to take advantage of that pool of EDRAM. So I think you could do something unorthodox like that. I think that maybe you could do something interesting with like a dedicated physics processing unit or areas of a GPU that are dedicated to physics processing on board a console SoC. I think you could also probably do something interesting at this point, although this isn't as console specific too much, but something interesting with chiplets, or maybe you can mix and match different chiplets to create different console SKUs, do a bunch of different console SKUs that way without having to design lots of bespoke chips, just combine like some Zen 6 CCXs or whatever and some graphics tiles and whatnot. But in general, I think it's hard at the moment because the consoles are so closely linked to PC, and you see so much stuff in the AMD portfolio in particular on PC and on consoles, or on consoles first, then on PC. So I think it's kind of hard to look at it right now.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. See, whenever you speak to Mark Cerny, he's not happy about PC comparisons. And with PlayStation 5, he'll be pointing to stuff like, repurposing a compute unit to produce this bespoke audio blog. He'll be talking about the file decompression hardware that's been built into PlayStation 5, which we know has produced great results. He'll be talking about the dedicated SSD built into the motherboard with a bespoke controller. He'll be talking about the DualSense controller with the haptics. There's a lot happening in the console space that isn't sort of primarily related to what choice of CPU and GPU architecture you have, because why would you create a bespoke GPU when you've got AMD who've been making these things for decades, producing good work? It just doesn't really make sense. Makes sense to make some tailored optimizations or changes. Obviously, going back to PlayStation 4, we had the additional asynchronous compute pipelines because, Sony looked at the design and thought, hey, this is actually a really good idea. Let's beef it up. And PS4 Pro, there were some interesting things they did there in terms of the checkerboarding hardware, which wasn't, didn't turn out to be as transformative as they might have hoped, but it was an interesting idea that was actually superseded by good software. In terms of what we're seeing on the consoles at the moment and stuff that is going to feed back into PC, again, Mark Cerny talked about that recently in terms of, looking to stuff like direct storage happening as a result of stuff that's happening in the console space. The file decompression block. I mean, NVIDIA has made a chip for the Switch 2 that has a file decompression block because it just makes sense, right? Bespoke hardware, dedicated hardware block within the processor that basically takes care of file decompression for you. Frees up a lot of CPU resources, and we can see that because PC doesn't have that at the moment. And you look at like The Last of Us Part 1, where all of that burden is being placed upon the CPU, meaning you need a much more powerful CPU to get console level performance. So I don't think the major architectural building blocks, like, I don't see Mark Cerny saying, right, okay, Cell 2.0, let's do it. x86 is fine, it's great. Maybe they'll move to ARM, which is a consideration that Microsoft has in mind, bearing in mind the FTC leaks that we saw. Radeon GPUs, they're great. The only real sort of game-changing difference you could potentially do would be to consider a partnership with NVIDIA instead, where the focus of that GPU changes somewhat. In actual fact, what we know of the PlayStation 5 Pro is that, a lot of the innovations that NVIDIA made, Sony has their own take on them. So I don't think there's going to be like major exotic consoles being produced, but there's going to be possibly the implementation of fixed function blocks that can actually produce game-changing differences. That's my take on it. Let's move on to this question. Comes from Dead Eyes. And they say, I'm tired of people crying about quote unquote poor optimization every time a new game comes out. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I interpret that phrase to generally mean the game runs worse than it should for the visuals / tech on display. What we end up seeing, though, is more along the lines of new tech pushing new boundaries every year, as it has always been. And suddenly people are upset that spec requirements have gone up too. Devs recommending using upscaling seems to really trigger people, as if instead devs should just optimize another 30% plus performance out of a game without making sacrifices in quality of the final product. Do you think devs deserve all the flack? Personally, I think a lot of people are just mad their 1080 Ti still isn't high end.
Well,
yeah, Tom, thoughts?
Well, there's two halves to that, isn't there? There's two parts to that. For sure, they shouldn't be using, developers shouldn't be using FSR and DLSS as a crutch to get, over performance hurdles. If there's like a specific area in the game which is just, is poorly balanced in terms of, assets being just ridiculously high quality, and then in certain other areas it's not. It makes sense for there to be a level, a fair expectation of what your GPU can do and what it can achieve in a game. But equally, I totally agree with Dead Eyes that, to be cutting edge, to stay on the front foot, you've got to always offer up something new that will slowly edge out, older GPU generations. And, it does mean we're slowly having to, it's more of a gradual process on the PC front. And you slowly notice it over the years that my GPU just isn't keeping up at 1440p. Let's say now I've got to drop to 1080p. I've got to use medium. We've all been there, and I think part of the thrill of PC gaming is that aspiration to I need a new GPU now to play this amazing new game to keep up. It's an expensive part of the gaming sector to have make a hobby out of. But fundamentally, that's kind of the deal you're making by being in the PC space. If you don't want to worry about that, go on the consoles.
Yeah, fair enough. Oliver?
Yeah, I think that there are definitely some games with unusually poor performance, I would say.
Yeah, there's some things where you look at it and think, why is this happening?
Yes. I would specifically point to, like you mentioned, Rich, The Last of Us Part 1 on PC runs a lot worse CPU bound. Maybe that's understandable because of the specialized hardware in the PS5. But it's also running a lot worse in GPU bound scenarios. I think like 30 or 40% worse than you might otherwise suspect.
There've been some traces done, and it's there's an occupancy issue on the GPU on the PC version that we can assume isn't there on PS5. And there's also been some people suggesting that the async compute, which is heavily utilized in the Naughty Dog engine, isn't so utilized on the PC port.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway.
I think you can point to titles like that where you say, hey, this is like a game that maybe it's using some bespoke features on one class of hardware. Maybe it's not interacting very well with like DirectX or another API or whatever. There are multiple reasons, right? But certainly there are examples of games performing unusually poorly on one platform relative to another and relative to their baseline level of hardware performance. But in general, I would kind of agree with the question that I think people are often complaining about the reality that more advanced and more modern games are using more advanced graphical techniques. People sometimes respond negatively to that if that has a performance impact. When you look at something like RTGI, for instance, you can have great looking lighting without RTGI. You can bake everything out and have a good looking game in the right circumstances. But when you move to RTGI, all of a sudden you're running your big game like Nobody Wants to Die or something, and it's not running especially well on the consoles, right?
Yeah.
So
I think that's it. Yeah.
So people are going to respond negatively to that. I don't know how you deal with that, right? In some cases, they might have a good point, but in other cases, I think you kind of have to say, well, this is where things are heading, and I think it's a good direction. But it's not that common that I actually look at a game on consoles and kind of wonder, like, why does this run the way it does? Usually, for the most part, especially with like these higher end titles, AAA titles, you understand why they run like they do for the most part. Like, games are produced at a very high level of technical competency, I would say, in general. Sometimes there are a couple areas where you can spot like easy performance wins, like, oh, they could use FSR here, they could do this there, they could do that, or whatever. But for the most part, games are not like, quote unquote, poorly optimized. They're usually reasonable for what they deliver.
Yeah, there are some classic examples where, you just feel that the balance in production wasn't right. Elden Ring is obviously the classic example.
Yeah.
And where the performance mitigation technologies they use, like a dynamic resolution scaling that's almost always at lower bounds anyway, resulting in frame drops. That's, that just doesn't seem right. But more generally, let's just go back and look at Unreal Engine 5 Matrix Awakens demo. It literally lets you play the demo, and then there's like a little segment there where it shows you all of the technologies and how they work. And one of those technologies is temporal super resolution, TSR. This is basically Epic saying to the world, we've produced this incredibly ultra realistic form of rendering, but we can't do it at native resolution. So we've created TSR upscaling to make this an enabling factor to make this exciting new technology actually run and actually be performant on a console. And that extends to PC too, because not everyone out there is going out there and buying an RTX 4090. So there is progress. And I agree with you, Tom, because back in the day, there would be a new game would come out. And I guess Crysis 1 is the classic example.
That is the big one, yeah.
Where, you ramp up all of the features and you find out that it doesn't really work on your PC anymore and you need to upgrade. And actually it was, people were excited about new technologies emerging that required, faster hardware. On the flip side, though, you do still want to have scalability. So, you can't really leave parts of your audience behind, especially in the modern era. So, it's. I agree with you, Oliver, that it's very rare that you find a game that's actually suboptimal. Certainly in the console space where they can tailor to the specific hardware. PC, obviously, it's a lot more challenging because they've got to accommodate people that are still using, 2016 era GPUs and really old CPUs. And I guess that's probably what Dead Eyes is saying here when he says that personally, I think a lot of people are just mad their 1080 Ti still isn't high end. But yeah, times have moved on, and it is typically coming in hand in glove with the arrival of new console hardware, because that does typically signify that, hey, the baseline has changed. Yeah, crying poor optimization happens more often than it should. Yeah, let's move on. Next question. This one from Paul Calamata. Given that Sony and Microsoft's move to x86 architecture in the X generation has borne so many advantages in terms of ease of development and backwards compatibility, why wasn't x86 adopted by earlier console generations? And do you foresee a future where the console makers move away from x86 again in favor of more bespoke or alternative architectures? Gotta say, this episode, if you're doing the DF bespoke drinking game, you're probably paralytic by now. Well, I think I can answer this one simply because there probably weren't cost-efficient versions of x86 processors available in prior generations. And what was available from the 8th generation onwards was, basically AMD had mastered the art of creating the APU, which is a single block of silicon that could contain area-efficient, relatively performant CPU cores, which were dwarfed by much larger GPUs on the die there. And I don't think that was possible in prior generations. I'm not sure that there were. I mean, if you consider what Jaguar was, it was an area-efficient x86 core designed primarily for the mobile market. So before that, there wasn't really a mobile market to consider. So I think that's why they've done it. Oliver, anything to add to that? Or indeed, do you foresee a future where the console makers move away from x86 again in favor of more bespoke or alternative architectures?
I think there might have also been a bit of a performance and area advantage to RISC, especially back then.
Right. Yeah, you're probably right.
Because RISC ISAs were pretty simple back then, especially. Nowadays, that's less so. So I think that the performance advantage probably back then would be a little bit more pronounced, potentially, when you're looking at like a MIPS CPU or something like that, or a PowerPC. And I think it's possible they might move back to RISC with like ARM stuff. That's always a possibility, or like RISC 5 maybe down the line when that's a bit more mature. I think it probably depends more on cost and power than any specific advantage of ARM or x86. I think there's also some question about what is the performance level of the cores that you're using, the specific cores that you're using. Right now, Qualcomm's Orion cores are kind of within striking distance of the AMD cores, but if you're looking for, let's say, the most single core performance potentially possible in a next generation console, maybe you would prefer to go with the Zen design, which probably maybe can clock higher, has higher APC possibly. There are some factors there that might lead you down that road. I think it's totally possible. I think it's just a question of what do the implementations look like cost and power wise, what makes sense for the console manufacturers. But I think they're kind of both in the same ballpark of performance where they can be considered. Whereas like if you go back 4 years, there was not really an ARM CPU core design that was going to be competitive with Zen 2. I think that's changed a lot now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The other thing in terms of ease of development, I mean, Switch has been using ARM cores for a long time now, and I don't really hear too many complaints from developers about, ease of development. It's more the limited horsepower that's available there. So I think ARM compilers are probably pretty good these days as well. So I'm not sure that's going to be too much of an issue. Let's move on to the question from Al Black. You guys mentioned last week that backwards compatibility on Xbox Series is rewrapped into an x86 executable. It's the same for Xbox One, by the way. Would it be possible for Microsoft to release these on Windows PC? Would there be any use case? Are there any Xbox 360 games that you'd like to see on PC via this emulation that you couldn't already play with a native PC app? Well, that's a pretty straightforward question, right? Because, yes, there's going to be Xbox 360 titles that are available on back compat that aren't available on PC. So I suspect, well, just off the top of my head, Crackdown would be one, I believe. There'll be a bunch of titles. Would there be a use case? I do believe there would be a use case because Microsoft wants you to be able to have an Xbox library of games that you can port across the generations. This is why we have the backwards compatibility program in the first place. And if the future of Xbox's console hardware is actually that it's more PC-like in nature anyway, and they're not entirely beholden to the user even owning an Xbox at all, why not open those games to run on PCs? I think they probably could.
Definitely.
Any thoughts on this one, Tom? Any games on Xbox 360 that,
Yeah, I mean,
should be available to PC?
Off the top of my head, I mean, two original Xbox Ones would be Phantom Dust and Panzer Dragoon Auto. But on 360, there's also Rockstar's Table Tennis, if you remember that one.
Right.
It got a Wii release, but it
Is it
was significantly pared down. Actually, it's a good point. I would like to check that. But if it isn't, Microsoft has to get on that.
Or Rockstar.
But yeah, all Rockstar, yeah. I guess from a business sense, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, it is part of the package. If it was part of an Ultimate Game Pass, that would be a hugely compelling bullet point on the list of reasons to have it. And but it's whether it's feasible, because I know that there's a rethreading that goes with making those games work on modern CPU architectures, and that's maybe tailored to just fixed platforms. And when you open that bracket out to so many permutations of CPUs and GPUs in the PC space, you might be opening up compatibility issues there.
I get what you're saying. I agree with you. It is tailored. The emulator is tailored to Xbox hardware, but on the counter to that, I'd say they've got it running on Xbox One, where the CPUs are actually really, really lackluster in performance terms. I did just do a quick Google for you, Tom. Good news. Rockstar's Table Tennis is available on back compat, and it does run on Xbox Series consoles.
Oh, fantastic. Great. I'm going to play that after this is done. Yes, that would be my vote.
Oliver, thoughts?
Yeah, in terms of games that I'd like to see, it would be kind of like those Gears of War titles. I think those would be top of mind. Like Gears 1 has a bad PC port. Gears 2 and 3 do not have PC ports. Gears Judgment does not have a PC port. Now, hopefully that'll change at some point with the release of some kind of collection or something. There's also Forza Horizon 1 now that's fully delisted, so you'd have to use a disc possibly for that, and that would be interesting. I don't know if that would be feasible at all. They're like the Fable games. There are lots of Xbox exclusive titles. There are a lot of 360 titles that didn't ship on PC because Microsoft's policy at that point was not necessarily to ship all their games on PC. It's a market change recently. But I do kind of wonder if licensing would be an issue at all. Because depending on how those licenses have been drafted, could they be specific to the console platforms? And I think if I was a publisher, I'd have a little bit more trepidation about allowing an emulator to run my game on PC officially than I would on a closed platform like a console. That could possibly be an issue. I don't think technically there would be the same hurdles, but I wonder if legally there could be some hurdles. I don't know what you think.
You could be quite right there.
Yeah.
I think you're right. And also, I don't know, maybe you could just limit it to people who actually have the game, who've bought the game in the past, and it's part of their libraries. So that, obviously at the moment you can't really buy a lot of Xbox 360 games since they've shut the marketplace. But, I do think that they could probably get the emulator running on modern PCs, probably have already. I'd like to see it. What can I say?
Yeah.
Let's move on to the final question. It's one specifically for Oliver here from Patrick Leban. Will the M4 iPad Pro's bright tandem OLED display be enough for Oliver to hop on T-OLED? This harkens back. Well, there's two things here. First of all, you're looking at the iPad Pro, the M4 iPad Pro for us. Secondly, you recently bought a new TV. You trialed an OLED. It wasn't bright enough for you. It didn't burn with the power of 1,000 suns. So you went LCD instead. But what do you reckon about Patrick's question?
So I would say yes. Traditionally, the problem with OLED displays in televisions is that you get high peak brightness, right? You can get to like 1400 nits, 1500 nits peak brightness. That's certainly achievable with like the latest generation of OLED panels. The problem is that in bright content, it really does pull back the brightness level. So those whites, which might have been 1400 nits before, are now like 200 nits or 300 nits. It's a very substantial reduction in the brightness level of those whites. Some people are not bothered by this. I personally am bothered by this. Now, with the OLED displays and mobile devices, that tends to be less of an issue. People do not tend to be limiting the brightness level as much in like full screen white. And on the tandem OLED display on the iPad, that's even less the case than it is in any device I've ever looked at in the past. It can go to 1,000 nits full screen white, which is pretty scorching. It can do 1,600 nits in the highlights, HDR highlights. It looks very good. It's not the brightest display I've ever used. That would be the brightest display I've ever used. But it is the brightest mobile display I've ever used. And I would probably say it's probably the best display I've ever used, everything all considered. Like it's 120 hertz, really low persistence. The brightness characteristics are just fantastic. Looks great. Viewing angles are very good. You know, what can you say? It's an OLED. You get perfect blacks. You get perfect control over every pixel. It looks awesome. So yeah, I would say that it is enough. It is enough for sure.
Well, hell has just frozen over. There are flying pigs. A squad full of flying pigs is flying by outside. But this is great news.
Yeah. I mean, I like OLEDs a lot, especially in devices that are a little bit smaller, like the iPhone. I think they're a great fit for mobile devices. Just then in the televisions, I think to control the heat output, they do limit white levels quite a bit in more bright content, and I tend to like rather scorching white content for whatever reason, where the best option really is an LCD television, a mini LED television for getting those super bright whites. But here, the brightness levels, are even in full white content, are very, very good.
That's great. Well, I'm really looking forward to your video. So might already be out by the time this direct goes public. Who knows? But anyway, that was the final question of this show. Therefore, it's the end of the show. Please do like, subscribe, share if you enjoyed it. Ring bells for notifications that may or may not appear. No guarantees, as ever. Store.digitalfoundry.net for all of our merchandising wares. And please do consider the DF supporter program for early access to each and every episode of DF Direct. Video downloads of every single video we've made since late 2016, and a whole bunch more great stuff. But that's all from us on this one. Thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry, and we'll see you next week.